We are very happy to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the epidemiology. We touched on it briefly last time, but we'll make some references to the presentation prior, but more importantly, really dig into um, the epidemiology that we were missing. Um, I'd like to start off with race-based health as a whole, specifically in this concept of career and aspirations in that second point there. In a study I was reading by the titled Neighborhood of Residents in Coronary Heart Disease. There was some data there in the following slide, actually, in table 2 on the following slide, um, that was suggesting that persons in whom coronary disease developed also tended to trend towards lower levels of income and education, and were less likely to have executive, managerial, or professional occupations like those in whom coronary disease did not develop. So you're welcome to delve into that there, but it's very interesting that we see the misrepresentation of Black individuals in secondary roles executed in having a secondary roles in their work lives as well. We can also go back to the previous slide and look a little bit more at sedentary lifestyles between races. As suggested by the American Journal of Epidemiology, white men, middle-aged men, live a more sedentary lifestyle than their Black equivalents. Um, we actually thought that that would not, we didn't think that white men would have more sedentary lifestyles. We thought they'd have less sedentary lifestyles. But even with more sedentary lifestyles, there are lower rates of coronary heart disease in men, white men to Black men. Um, so we think that this is more related to the socioeconomic factors and less based on race. For example, the Journal of Adolescent Health um, talked about um, education as a whole. Education can create opportunities for better health, and poor health can put education attainment at risk in and of itself. There was an article I was reading that suggested that persons with a college degree or even a high school diploma lived significantly longer than those who lacked either the GED or the high school education alone. Even the housing has a significant factor on your health incomes. Health outcomes, excuse me. Your neighborhood of residence, as suggested by Dr. Levy, suggests that the impact of non-healthy homes are far-reaching in that large racial gaps exist between high-income houses and low-income housing as a whole. Um, and then obviously with that, bad housing specifically with lower economic class families like minority families contributes to an inability to create lasting wealth, to buy the resources and the healthcare needs to combat the more sedentary lifestyles that individuals live, as suggested in um, that second table there in that article titled "Neighborhood of Residents in Coronary Heart Disease."
So, while data I previously discussed concluded that steps actually increased for children during video game use, this data was from a small study and it indicated the use of active video games. However, if children are playing video games in a sedentary environment with foods present that are potentially calorie rich and nutrient poor, it is likely that the usage of video games is not monitored with the same scrutiny as a study would monitor. So, if we go to the next slide, we can see the increase of obesity, the prevalence of obesity in US toddlers and teens. And simultaneously, although this is not shown the trend line, we'll see it later with Allison as Allison's talking about her piece. We see an increase in violence and we also see an increase in video game usage. So, is it possible that in this way, video games can contribute to increasing levels of morbid obesity and therefore contribute to cascading concerns with health and activity? Which would then therefore lead to, as CJ was talking about, the um, higher prevalence of comorbidities, particularly with folks who are from lower socioeconomic environments. So, as we know, video games also have a varying level of violent and explicit imagery. A majority of the top 10 games sold are identified with a mature rating. The general aggression model posits that individual factors, such as attitudes toward violence, trait aggression, and situational factors, such as exposure to real life violence or media violence, are interact to influence the components of an individual's internal state, such as their physiological arousal, feelings, and thoughts. So, in this way, a person's feedback loop of aggression is exemplified with the heightened consumption of violent imagery and action. And as you can see here, the general aggression model just shows that biological modifiers and environmental modifiers can then correlate to or connect to develop a person's personality, and then that personality, dependent on where they have various inputs, can provide different sorts of outcomes. And it's possible that video game usage actually could increase impulsive actions or impulsive responses. So what other kind of aspects would contribute to aggressive behavior in children, as I'm talking about young people? It could be video games, but it could be the fact that they're we're looking at potentially people who are in have less resource, and as I said, might have food diets that are calorie rich and nutrient poor, might not have the full kind of support that somebody who doesn't exhibit sort of violent behavior has. So, a few of the studies that I looked at, there are limited studies, but these two studies had an equal amount of boys and girls, and tried to also have like a good balance of diversity within the studies. One study had 1,000 participants and was in the UK. Another study had about 500 participants, and it was here in the US. They did provide evidence that there was a tiny bit of an increase in potentially aggressive behavior when children use games that are maybe first person shooters or have other kinds of impulsive behavior. But they recorded this by like, if they had some kind of interaction, would they like have an impulsive response, or would they have a more thoughtful response to this? So it ultimately, in the end, didn't have any positive correlation, but there's definitely space for more studies in this area. So I wrote, despite the null findings identified in this study, there's history can give reason to believe that violent video games are causing an increase in violent actions, as are outlined in the general aggression model.
Kind of going off of that, if you take a look at these graphs here, we see that down here in the corner, we have the type of platform and their revenue per year. And this trend begins to go on the uprise down in the right, bottom left. But we also take a look at the top right, there's an increase in violence right around the time that video games begin to become popular. And we see that like even just between we see that like the development of first person shooter games kind of comes into play, and we can see like the aggression with firearms. And there's no direct there weren't like studies saying that violence, like video games directly influence violence, as Sasha said previously, but we see these common trend lines and the amount of growth that could be studied for this topic. It kind of leads us to believe that it's heavily possible that violent video games are the reason for an increase in violence throughout the time. And these trend lines show exactly that. Even here, when we show by genre, when we see action and fighting becoming two of the leading selling games over the years, over in this 1970s, 80s to 2000 range. We also see up here in the top right that there's a large increase in violence. And because of the room for growth in this field of study, it's hard to not believe that these two things are correlated with one another.